Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. I am so grateful you are joining us today for this important conversation that we talk about often, but I like this angle we're going today when we're talking about self-care and self-expertise, that word expertise of yourself. And I'm a firm believer in knowing yourself, understanding who you are, why you are the way you are, getting curious about it, deconstructing it. So I'm really excited for my guest today. Welcome, Taylor, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I'm going to read your bio because it's very impressive. Taylor Elyse, that's my daughter's middle name, by the way, spelled exactly the same, which I love. Morrison is a founder, facilitator, coach, and serial entrepreneur, making well-being and personal development more accessible. Through her company, Inner Workout, and her book of the same name, Taylor supports people's journey to know, care for, and become their full selves. So I'm so glad you're here. I love your book title, Inner Workout. Tell me how you came up with the name.
The idea came to me on a yoga mat. So Inner Workout is also the name of my company, is now the name of my book. And I don't know if you ever have it where you go to yoga and you're like sitting there, you're a little bit early. That's where some of my best ideas happen. So I was sitting there kind of trying to get centered. And I felt this idea pop into my head that was like, what if we could help people build the skill of self-care? Because a big part of my journey is a lot of overachieving, a lot of perfectionism. And I feel like I learned how to kind of quote unquote play the game. But in my adulthood, I had to learn how to take care of myself. And I wanted to create a company and to create resources that help people develop self-care as a skill, because I wish I would have had more of that in my life.
How do you help people work through like the guilt of taking care of themselves and the narrative of, oh, I need to be putting my family first. I need to be working. I need to be doing all these things. How do you help people work through that guilt and maybe some shame of not feeling worth it or good enough?
Absolutely. And this is something I see both with people I work with, but also in my own life, feeling like I need to earn care. So I'll start by sharing the definition that we use of self-care at Inner Workout, which is that self-care is listening within and responding in the most loving way possible. So I really think of self-care as a conversation that I'm having with myself rather than a list of actions to do. And that shift can actually help me overcome some of the guilt instead of like thinking about it as taking time away from something else or other people that I'm supposed to be there for. It's, oh, I'm caring for myself by staying in conversation with myself and giving myself what I need throughout the day rather than making it this other thing. But to come back to your question around the guilt, I have a question I encourage people to ask, is it the self or is it the system? And this question can come in a lot of areas. But when we're thinking about guilt and shame, we can ask, okay, what part of this is coming from me? What part of this is pressure, expectations, narratives that I have placed on myself that I can work through? And what part of this is the system that we live in that tells us, for example, that women should be there for everyone else and put their needs to the bottom? And I find that in acknowledging some of the realities of the systems that can make us feel guilt, it actually lessens some of the guilt and pressure that we put on ourselves to realize, oh yeah, I am thinking this way, but I've also explicitly or implicitly for a good portion of my life been told that I should feel guilty for taking care of myself. And acknowledging that, for me at least, and I've seen it with other people too, it allows you to take some of the power back and be like, oh, I don't necessarily want to feel guilty for this. I've been told to feel guilty for it, but that's not guilt that I want to hold for myself.
Yes, I love that question. Is it yourself or is it the self or the system? And I feel like majority of the time it's coming from a system message. Do you find that?
Yeah, so often. And even when I trace things back, sometimes it'll be like, oh, it seems like that's me. But then I'll ask a follow-up question and be like, oh, well, when I was younger, the kids who were at school who were cool acted like this. And so this is my response to that system that I grew up in. And it's not to say that there aren't things that are just totally intrinsic, but a lot of times it's a mix of a system that we have been living in and our response to that system, at least in my experience and some of what I've seen working with clients.
So you're on the yoga mat and you're like, inner workout comes to you. You decide, I want to create a program for women to be able to take care of themselves or have self-care at the forefront. And then where do you go from there?
It has been such a winding journey. So my first thought was I built this practice that blended movement, breathwork, journaling, and meditation. And it was called the Inner Workout. And the whole idea was that you'd have this 45 to 60 minutes where you were practicing listening and responding through these different modalities. So that was the first iteration of Inner Workout as the company. And then COVID hit. And we had planned to do facilitator trainings. And a lot of what I was doing was in person. And it was this weird situation where people needed self-care. It was one of the most searched terms of 2020. And also the way that I originally planned to help people practice self-care didn't translate as well in the COVID world. So that's how we shifted to doing more workshops. I developed the Take Care assessment, which measures well-being across 5 dimensions and then gives you this personalized PDF based on your results. And I saw that having this different set of resources was the way to help people build self-care. And then now that we're in this world where I can do things in person, but actually our community expanded more globally. So it still makes sense to stay doing mostly virtual things, mix of individual things that you can do, like you can get a digital workbook, or group things like a coaching program.
So tell me how breath work, because I love breath work in terms of self-care, because you started with breath work, meditation. It sounds like you had these very practical and powerful ways to recenter yourself. How did breath work get into the mix?
Yeah. So at Inner Workout, everything that we do is built on these 5 dimensions of well-being that are inspired by this yogic concept of the koshas. So those 5 dimensions are physical, energetic, mental and emotional. That's 1, wisdom and bliss. And there's sub-dimensions underneath them, and the Take Care assessment breaks that down more. So does the book. But in the energetic dimension, our breath is part of how we regulate our energy. And depending on what you did growing up, maybe if you were a singer or a swimmer or played certain instruments, you learned how to use your breath. You learned how to breathe in an optimal way. And everyone else tends to not breathe in optimal ways. We tend to be slouching. For us women, sometimes we don't want to let our belly expand because we're worried about our belly taking up too much space. And I mean, there's so much good research about how the different ways that we can breathe literally change our experience in our body and our experience of our situation. So breathwork still is one of the things that I will recommend with clients. I love how before we started, we did deep breaths. That's how I start coaching sessions too. And when I'm working with organizations, I'm often trying to teach them these quick little breath things that we can do. One of my favorites personally is just taking longer exhales. It's so easy to do. And you don't have to be, I think we picture sometimes the really extreme breath work where people are really getting their body into it, but I do extended exhales in a meeting.
Yes. I love that because it's you can do it anytime, anywhere. It's not like you have to do this. I've got to sit down on my yoga mat. That is also very helpful. And you can do it in your day-to-day life when you're in a meeting or on a Zoom call. or with your kids or
Absolutely.
with a friend or whenever you feel that. And do you recommend doing it when you say practice? What does that look like for people that don't do breath work?
So I love how you mentioned you can be on your yoga mat and you could do it when you're out and about. One of the things that we talk about it in our workout is this idea of proactive and responsive self-care. So proactive self-care, those things that you put on your calendar, you plan ahead of time because they know that they lead you to a certain end state. So it could look like having a morning routine that works well for you, or it could be, that you're really nervous when you public speak. And so you might have something that you do beforehand proactively to support you, and you might have something that you do afterward every time to help you decompress. So that's proactive self-care. Responsive self-care are those things that you do in the moment where you're like, I'm feeling dysregulated. My kid said something that was rude, but they didn't fully realize the ramifications of it. Or my boss sent me an email and now I'm stressed. They put a meeting on my calendar I didn't expect. And now my mind is spinning about what they want to talk about. Responsive self-care is what we do to ground ourselves back into the present. So when it comes to breath work, we could do it proactively where we know like, okay, before I have this presentation meeting, I'm going to spend 5 minutes deep breathing. Or every night before I go to bed, I do a couple of minutes of that. But you could also do it responsibly, where in the moment you feel that you're getting nervous, or you feel you really want to like say some choice words to your boss, and you choose to respond by doing a little breath work and then deciding how you want to engage with that situation.
I love that. You're saying proactive and then kind of, it's more like a grounding in the moment.
Yeah.
How do I get recentered in the moment? And then the preparation, if I'm nervous about something or you have stress coming up, how can you, before that happens, have a practice for yourself to kind of center yourself so you're more regulated? I love that. When you were talking about self-expertise and self-care, talk to me about that concept. How did you develop it? How do people become more of an expert for themselves, within themselves?
Yeah. And I know you mentioned at the beginning that this is something that's important for you too. And I find that for the best practitioners, they do value the fact that it's not about you or me. It is about the person and helping them know that they're the expert of their own experience. Unfortunately, what can happen a lot in the like self-care, well-being, personal development space is you have people who don't have your best interest in mind, who are more concerned about saying, well, this works for me, so this should work for everyone. And if you just follow my 5-step formula, if you just copy paste exactly what I do, then you should get the same results. And that can be unhelpful when maybe that person is single and you've got 3 kids. Or maybe that person lives in a completely different part of the country. So what is easily accessible to them, like going hiking every weekend, isn't accessible to you half of the year because it's really cold and snowy. So when I think about self-care, and again, going back to that definition of listening within and responding in the most loving way possible, listening within, listening to you,
I
not
love
just
that.
listening. Yes. So when you're practicing self-care the way that I talk about it, then inherently you're building your self-expertise because you're getting to know yourself. And that isn't to say like you're listening to this podcast, and it is good that you are choosing to listen to this podcast and do other things for yourself. But when other people's voices start to kind of the volume is louder than your inner voice, that's when we have a problem. And it starts to move from being helpful to less helpful and sometimes even harmful.
Yes. And I think there can be some dependency on an outside guide, if you will, that can take you off course rather than knowing that you are equipped with the navigational tools inside of you. So I feel like what I do as a therapist is I delayer all of these conditions that haven't been helpful, the beliefs that really have kept people stuck, to get to that voice that never got heard, that didn't have space to share and express. And then once we get to that, that is trying to give me information that's helpful in making a decision, or trusting your gut, trusting your vibes. We're not really taught to do that in so many ways. Or we're saying, trust your gut. And then we're like, well, I don't know. Are you sure? Then with somebody will put that seed of doubt. And then you're like, well, now I don't know. I thought I knew, but now I don't. So how do you help people tap into and trust their intuition and their knowingness is what I call it? How do we get there?
It's a journey, as is all of the good stuff that we do in life. I was going to say, I wish we could snap our fingers, but I really don't, because I think the process is the prize. Like, I think being in the process and in the work is what gives us all of the benefits when we finally arrive at the destination. And if we just arrived at the destination, we'd be missing the critical learnings of being in the process. So the starting point I recommend for people is to find a little pocket of time where you can hear from yourself. And hearing from yourself looks different for everyone. I have a client who literally will hear from herself because she likes to record voice notes, and she'll process it out loud. So that's one element of processing. And then she'll listen to it back. And that's another element of processing. And that works really well for her. Some people like to sit in silence. Some people like to journal. You often hear how people will get brilliant insights right before bed or in the shower. So it's finding that time for you. That's one part of it. Just starting to realize there is wisdom within me. If I give it space and I'm not always crowding it out by music or a podcast or by having TV in the background, there is wisdom within me. And then the second piece of it is starting to act on it. And that really takes time. It can be little things like you're at your favorite restaurant and you almost always get the same dish, but you feel that little voice saying, ooh, try this. And you decide to try it. Or you're walking. This happened the other day. I was hiking over the weekend and I was like, okay, there's a fork in the road, literal fork in the road. Which way am I going to go? And just checking in, which one feels right now? I'm going to get to the same destination, but I chose to go down the right path. And that was me building trust with my inner wisdom. So those little moments of doing it throughout the day make it a lot easier when you're making big decisions like a cross-country move or changing a job. You've developed that trust already, but it's hard to build trust with someone that you're not in a relationship with. You've got to be in a relationship with yourself.
What do you say for people that don't like themselves? And they're like, I don't even like that voice in my head. I don't even like that part of me. I don't trust that voice. How do you help people start loving that part, like themselves, I guess, and that voice in their head?
What came to mind when you asked that question is a concept of body neutrality that I think that you could put in a lot of things, because again, self-help, personal development spaces, we talk about loving yourself and having affirmations. And it feels like if I'm doing the work, quote unquote, right, that I'm supposed to be head over heels in love with myself all of the time. And I don't know about you. I saw that you have a ring. I've been with my husband for 12 years now, and I love him so much, but I don't always feel like I love him. And the bar that I was setting for my relationship was that I had to feel head over heels in love with him every day. Then I'd be failing a decent amount of the time. Want us to extrapolate that to ourselves. It is okay if you're not feeling head over heels in love with yourself every day, but maybe we could work towards getting to a point of neutrality. Instead of active dislike and disdain for yourself, let's get to a place where it's a neutral, where it's like, oh, hey, that's my inner voice. Okay, I hear you. It doesn't have to mean anything. I don't have to talk about how annoying you are or how amazing you are. Let's just try and get to neutrality first.
I love that. That's so true, because you're not going to love yourself all the time. It's a bunch of hooey pooey. I mean, that's just not reality, because you're going to have things come up that you don't like, and that's okay. That's totally okay. What do you say to people that have so much self-doubt? Like, for example, when someone's making a decision, like you were talking about the fork in the road, you didn't think there's a right and wrong way to go. You just thought, where does my heart pull me? I don't know exactly what you asked yourself, but you kind of knew you're at a fork in the road. How do people get out of this? There's a good and bad and right and wrong answer, which creates that self-doubt. How do you help people work through that self-doubt?
I resonate with this so much. I'm like, are you just asking me the question I need to ask for myself right now? Something I've been noticing in myself a lot, and this is a very human thing. We like binary choice. We like either or thinking. And so we want to say this is right or wrong. This is good or bad. I'm good or bad. That person is good or bad. When in reality, there's so much nuance, and it is very, very, very rare that something is completely good or completely bad. So for me, the starting point has just been recognizing this is binary thinking right now. What could another option be? So that's work that I do with myself, that I'll also do with clients too. Let's think of 1, 2, 3, 10 other possibilities that could be true whenever I'm getting caught in the binary thinking. And I don't want to rush over, because I kind of got into an exercise after that, but I want to acknowledge that even just the act of you noticing you're in binary thinking is already putting you in more of an observer role rather than being so caught in it. So if all you can do, you can't even get to choosing the other options, but you can just notice, oh, I'm in binary thinking again. That is progress. And that's worth celebrating. And then when you're ready, you can start to play with other options, and you realize most of the things that we are freaking out about, we're going to be okay if we go left or right. Even if you make a job move that ends up not being the right fit, you will be okay.
I love this conversation, because the truth is you will be, it may not feel okay right in the moment, but eventually it's like when you have a breakup and you're like, oh, I see now that was kind of for me and I can see how I've grown through it. But in the middle of it, it's hard to see it. It's hard to see that it's going to be okay when we're in the middle of it. So how do people kind of know, how do you help people get to it will be okay? Because I think that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid they won't be okay, or it won't be okay. They won't, and it won't be okay.
That's hard. The first thing that comes to mind is just like empathy and acknowledging. Even like you said, it may not feel okay, but that doesn't mean that it won't be okay ultimately. So being able to sit and just acknowledge however you're feeling. And you almost did it second nature, because I would assume you're a pretty self-aware person. But for other people, that might be a lot to notice. Oh, the fear that I'm feeling right now is I'm feeling like I'm not going to be okay. I'm feeling like this is never going to be okay. And maybe asking yourself, what is my biggest fear here? What is the worst case scenario here? And just sitting with that acknowledgement of, okay, that's where I think it's going. And then you can start to get a little bit more rational, like, okay, how likely is that it's going to happen? I was just doing this with my therapist yesterday, where I was acknowledging, yeah, I'm feeling afraid of this thing. I can notice how the fear shows up in my body. And also, once I've felt that emotion and I look at it logistically, I know that there's a 1% chance of that actually happening. So I'm going to act like there's a 1% chance of that happening rather than letting the fear rule the show. And the other thing that's coming to mind is I've been obsessed with this book called The Extended Mind. That's all about how we tend to live in our heads, and our wisdom is so, as humans, is so holistic. And there's a lot of wisdom in being in the body. So another thing I've noticed is like, ooh, I'm getting really in my head right now about this. What would happen if I tapped into my body? What would happen if I got in nature? What would happen if I was connecting to other pieces instead of letting my brain run the show?
I love this. I'm going to have to check this book out. The Extended Mind. It sounds fascinating.
I want to say, I think it's by Annie Murphy Paul. I think so. That's such a specific name that it would be funny if I made that up.
That's amazing if you did. If you're like, it is. That's awesome. I do think we've been so conditioned in school to be in our head. That's what we're like, the testing and all of this information we're supposed to regurgitate. School really reinforces being in your head. So no wonder we get in loops. I call it looping, when you're just like, I'm looping on the same thing. How do you help people get out of a loop? A looping thought, a looping fear, a looping self-doubt, whatever. How do you help people through that, getting out of their minds and into their bodies?
So sometimes I literally will just get in my body personally. And I made a rule for myself that when I start to notice that happening, I'm either going to get active or I'm going to make art. So those have been the things that I started doing, where I'm like, I'm going to dance around, I'm going to stretch for a little bit, or I'm going to doodle or do something artistic. And both of those are ways for me to access a different part of my brain. And the goal isn't to ignore what's happening. The goal is just to realize like, okay, I've spent enough time here. Let me do something else. So if anyone else wants to make that rule and you're like, yeah, when I notice this happening, I'm going to get active or make art. And this isn't saying like you need to do a 60-minute yoga class. It can be, I'm going to stretch for 2 minutes. I'm going to doodle a flower for 2 minutes. So that's worked well for me. I think also in one of the things that I was taught in my coach training that comes from acceptance and commitment therapy that I really like is just saying, I'm having the thought that XYZ. And again, gets you back into that observer brain. So instead of me being the thought and being so close to the thought, I'm having the thought. And then you say, I notice that I'm having the thought. And all of a sudden you're like, instead of being in this thought that I am a bad person or whatever, and you're just like so enmeshed with the thought, you can get a little bit of distance and a little bit of difference and just a little bit more distance. And with distance comes perspective. I heard someone describe it once as like being a movie theater and being so close up to the screen. And if you're watching like, I don't know, a Marvel movie or something, and you're so close up to the screen, you're barely seeing anything. Versus when you get back and you're like, oh, there's a whole movie here. And that's what I think that exercise can help you start to do.
Yeah, I like the distancing gives you that perspective. How did you come up with the definition of self-care? Like, how did that come through to you?
It's a lovely question. I feel like it was an overtime situation where I went through my whole journey. I come to this work because I'm bad at self-care. And so as I started practicing self-care and trying to make myself feel cared for on a daily basis, I realized that what I was doing was listening and responding. And it was showing up in many different ways. But the core of what I was doing was checking in. What do I need? Hearing myself speak, and then finding ways to give that to myself, even if it was only in a small way. So I think the first iteration of the definition was listen to your body and respond in the most loving way possible. But then as I got exposed to the koshas and started building out the 5 dimensions of well-being, I realized it was so much more than just listening to my physical body. I was listening to my whole self in this really integrated way.
That's so beautiful. One of the things I like that you're saying is you said, what do I need? And what I see in all of us, including myself, is there's unmet needs from childhood or from wherever. We didn't get a need met. We didn't get heard. We didn't get seen. We didn't get understood. We didn't get acknowledged for what we feel. We didn't have space, maybe some of us, to have a voice. And we have this unmet need. And I almost feel like self-care for what you just said is asking yourself, what do I need? And now I'm going to honor that need and provide that need to myself. Would that be another way to capture it?
Absolutely. And it's funny because it is all about needs and wants and desires and honoring that. And I feel sometimes, and this could be my own projection, that if I were to lead with listening to your needs, that could even turn some people off because it's like, am I allowed to have needs? What do I need? Like, I have been doing work personally on starting to really understand what is it that I want? Because for so long, for a lot of reasons that do go back to childhood, I trained myself not to want things or to minimize what I want.
That's such a good point, because there's a point where you might honor the leading you get or the inside of you. So let me give you an example. So I started this podcast and I love vulnerability. So that's what this podcast is. I do vulnerability so I can model what that looks like to share authentically. And I remember my mother saying, you are everywhere. My worst fear was people are going to think it's my ego and people are going to think it's all about me, where I just want to be of service. Like, that's my heart. That's my soul. And I could feel like, oh, am I selfish? Am I about self-doubt creeping in? So I want to acknowledge, like, some people might be, oh, my needs are too much, or I'm too much, or that's not okay. People are going to think you're selfish, or people are going to think it's all about you. And that can take someone out of listening to the voice, doing what, and thank goodness I do my own work and I recognized it in the moment. I recognized my body. I recognized my shame. I could recognize that feeling inside that wanted to take me out of listening to the leading I was getting. Do you see that happen with people? I see it a lot. People will say something to them and that shuts them down almost as a way to self-protect.
Absolutely. I see this happen regularly where I can be talking with a client, may have worked with them for a while. We've got some things that we know are true in terms of what they value. And then they have a conversation with a partner or a family member, and it could be an offhand comment. And all of a sudden, it's the image that comes to mind is like the foundation shakes. And it's like, well, I have to change everything because now they think this about me, or this is true. And we've got to bring them back to themselves. Like, okay, let's acknowledge how that made you feel. And is the fact that this interaction made you feel this way, do you want it to mean now that you change all your values and all of what you've been working towards? And what we often find is that no, they still value what they value. But without doing that work, it's so easy to just change and say, like, you could have said, okay, podcast is over. I'm not doing this anymore. But you have the tool set and the skill set to acknowledge what was happening and then say, I know where I'm coming from. I'm going to continue to do this work in a way that feels in integrity. And when people don't have that self-awareness or that support, that's how they end up basically living other people's definition of success.
Isn't it true? Because I want people to think XYZ of me. I want them to like me. I want them to think I'm this whatever person, whatever we want people to think about us, because we're so worried about what people think about us, and that we can totally abandon ourselves in the process. And now we've given up our hopes, our dreams, our needs, our wants, because we don't want anybody to be upset with us. We don't want anybody to think ill of us. We don't want anybody to think differently of us. People pleasing and fawning as a survival state. Like, I'll fawn, right, to protect myself from blame, shame, rejection, judgment. Some of our worst fears are to be rejected or abandoned. And maybe we have had an experience of being abandoned or rejected. It's deep. Self-care can be such a deep rumble when we really unpack it. So I agree. It's a journey. It's a journey of self-discovery. It's a journey of delayering. And that's why I love coaching and therapy and programs, because it takes you on the quest to be able to connect to that inner knowing part. And then I'm like, well, I've worked myself out of a job. Yay. Because that's the beauty of what we do. We lead people back to themselves.
Yes. And I love that vision that you just gave of like, it's the quest. There's something so like beautiful and poetic of realizing, yeah, you're on this like adventurous quest. And sometimes it doesn't always feel the most fun, but yeah, that gave me a whole image in my mind.
Is there anything we didn't talk about in terms of self-care, self-expertise that you wanted to mention?
No, I feel like we covered a lot of ground. What I would just offer to people who are listening is take that time to check in with yourself and continue to use your language to honor those needs, even in the smallest ways. The other thing that I see people do is kind of discounting, like, oh, well, this doesn't really matter. It's just choosing what to eat for lunch. This doesn't really matter. It's just 2 minutes of breathing. That matters. And that's worth celebrating. So any little thing that you're doing for yourself, celebrate that. Take that opportunity to care for yourself.
Yeah, it just made me think when you were like, what you choose for lunch. Some people are like, well, where do you want to eat? And you're like, I don't care, wherever you want to go. I'll give that as like a first trial run. I'm like, let's offer 3 options that you want. And they're like, ooh, this is scary. I mean, just even that, just to even say what you want is scary for people, because we didn't get that as a kid. A lot of us, some did, but a lot of folks didn't. And just you saying that, I'm thinking, yeah, start with something, start with a step of awareness. And that is such a gift in and of itself, to your point, that awareness of honoring that part of you that says, yeah, I'm so used to going along with, because I don't want to rock the boat, of whatever you want to eat. And then you're like, how about Mexican? And you're like, I don't want that, or whatever. Start with saying something honest about what you want. How do you feel about that? Like, as a first step?
It's one of those things that, again, seems so simple, but could just have an amazing ripple effect when you really lean into it.
Yes. I've loved our conversation. I am so excited about it. I can't wait for it to air. So where can people find you, Taylor?
Yeah, the best place to go is to Inner Workout's website, innerworkout.co, not .com. And you can click to take the free Take Care assessment there. There's also a button right there to get the book. And we have a free weekly newsletter called Self-Care Sundays. We're kind of on Instagram at Inner Workout, and I'm at Taylor Elyse Morrison, but I kind of only go on there when I feel like it. So those are the consistent places to find us.
Yes. I love, see, that's you honoring, that's you doing self-care. Just even you saying like, I only get on it when you feel like it. Yes. Okay. I just want to acknowledge that. I got really excited. And then I love your self-care Sundays. That's great. So thank you so much, Taylor, for your heart and your service. And I'm so grateful you are on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, Kristen, Boyce, BOICE.com. Thanks and have a great day.